Everything began the night the crickets stopped singing, and the graveyard started to breathe. Thomas Mercer had been fixing engines for 38 years. His shop sat at the edge of Coldwater, Montana, a town so small it didn't appear on most maps, just a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a grain elevator and a church whose white paint had been peeling for as long as anyone could remember. The shop smelled like motor oil and rust and the coffee that had been sitting on the burner since dawn. It was a smell that had become home to Thomas, more familiar than the empty house he returned to each night. His wife Sarah had died 6 months ago, pancreatic cancer, quick and cruel, the kind that gave no time for preparation or peace, just a sudden collapse from vibrant life into hospital beds and morphine drips, and then nothing. The silence that followed her death was unlike any silence Thomas had ever known. It wasn't just the absence of her voice or her laughter or the small sounds she made moving through the house. It was deeper, a void that swallowed meaning itself, leaving him adrift in routines that felt increasingly hollow. He'd tried to maintain normalcy, opened the shop at 7 every morning, fixed tractors and pickup trucks and the occasional sedan from summer tourists passing through on their way to Glacier National Park, attended church on Sundays, sitting in the same pew he and Sarah had occupied for 20 years, now with an empty space beside him that felt more present than any living person. The pastor spoke about heaven and reunion and God's mysterious plan, and Thomas nodded at the appropriate moments while feeling absolutely nothing. The truth was, Thomas didn't know what he believed anymore. He'd grown up with faith as solid as Montana bedrock, God in heaven, Jesus as Savior, the promise of eternal life for those who believed. But Sarah's death had shaken that foundation, not because he was angry at God exactly, more because death had revealed itself as so absolute, so final, so utterly extinguishing that the idea of consciousness surviving it seemed like wishful thinking, like a story humans told themselves to make the unbearable slightly more bearable. Sarah was gone. Her body had been cremated according to her wishes. Her ashes sat in an urn on their bedroom dresser, next to the photograph of them on their wedding day, both of them young and certain that love could conquer anything. Thomas couldn't bring himself to scatter the ashes yet, couldn't let go of that last physical remnant, even though he knew rationally that ashes weren't Sarah, had never been Sarah, were just the mineral residue of a body that had once housed something infinitely more precious. On the night everything changed, Thomas had been working late in the shop, a combine harvester with a seized engine, the kind of job that required patience and precision and the ability to lose yourself in mechanical problems that had clear solutions. Unlike grief, unlike death, unlike the question of whether the person you loved most in the world still existed somewhere or had simply ceased to be. The shop's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across workbenches cluttered with wrenches and rags and parts waiting to be installed. Through the open bay door, Thomas could see the Montana night, vast and dark, with stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. Sarah had loved the stars, used to make him stop work and come outside just to look at them, pointing out constellations and making up stories about the spaces between the official patterns. Thomas wiped grease from his hands and stepped outside for air. The September night was cool, carrying the scent of approaching autumn and harvested wheat fields. The crickets that usually filled the darkness with their rhythmic chirping were silent, completely silent, as if the entire insect world had paused to listen to something Thomas couldn't yet hear. That's when he noticed the light. It wasn't coming from the road or the distant farmhouses scattered across the valley. It was rising from the old cemetery at the edge of town, maybe a quarter-mile from his shop. The graveyard where Sarah's name was now carved into granite beside a plot that held nothing but symbolic earth, since her ashes remained in the bedroom they'd shared. The light was soft, silvery, like moonlight, but more intentional. It seemed to pulse with a rhythm that reminded Thomas of breathing, gentle expansion and contraction, as if the cemetery itself had become a living thing. His first thought was vandals, teenagers with flashlights maybe, or someone playing a prank. But the light was too steady, too purposeful, and there was something else, a feeling in the air, a presence. The same sensation he'd experienced once before, years ago, when he'd been alone in the mountains and had the sudden overwhelming awareness of being watched by something vast and patient and utterly beyond human categories of threat or safety. Thomas found himself walking toward the cemetery without consciously deciding to go. His feet carried him across the gravel parking lot, past the chain-link fence that marked the boundary between his property and the town proper, down the dirt road that led to the cemetery gates. The wrought iron entrance stood open, which was unusual. The gates were supposed to be locked at sunset, but they hung wide as if welcoming visitors. The light grew stronger as Thomas entered. It seemed to emanate from the center of the graveyard, near a cluster of older headstones dating back to the town's founding in the 1880s. Thomas walked between rows of graves, reading names he recognized. Neighbors, former customers, Sarah's parents, gone long before her. The markers stood like silent witnesses to the accumulated losses of a small town over more than a century. And then he saw the source of the light. It stood among the headstones, impossible and undeniable, not human, not anything Thomas had words for. The being was tall, perhaps 8 feet, with a form that seemed to shift between solid and translucent, as if it existed in multiple states simultaneously. Its shape suggested something vaguely humanoid, but refined in ways that made human proportions seem clumsy by comparison. Where a face should be, there was only a smooth surface that somehow conveyed attention, presence, awareness. The light emanated from the being itself, that soft silver glow that made the headstones cast long shadows and illuminated the carved names with reverent clarity. Thomas should have been terrified. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee back to the familiar safety of wrenches and engines and problems that made sense. But fear didn't come. Instead, he felt something closer to recognition, as if some part of him had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. The being turned toward him, and Thomas felt its attention like a physical touch, gentle, curious, sorrowful in a way that transcended human sadness and touched something universal. Then it spoke, not with sound, not with words that traveled through air and vibrated eardrums. The communication bypassed language entirely, arriving directly in Thomas's consciousness as pure meaning, as if the being was sharing thoughts the way humans might share breath. You come to the place where the bodies rest, but you know they are not here. You know the ones you mourn are elsewhere, or nowhere. You carry this uncertainty like a wound that will not heal. Thomas's legs went weak. He sat down hard on a nearby bench, its wood weathered by decades of Montana weather. His hands trembled. "Sarah," he managed to whisper aloud, though he knew the being would understand regardless of whether he spoke. "My wife. She died, and I don't know where she is. If she is, if consciousness survives, or if it just ends." The being moved closer, its presence radiating something that felt like compassion but was deeper, older, informed by an understanding that spanned more than human lifetimes could contain. "Death is your species' greatest teacher, and your greatest source of denial. You have built elaborate stories around it. Beautiful stories, comforting stories. Stories about heaven and hell, about judgment and reward, about souls ascending to paradise or descending to punishment. These stories contain fragments of truth, but they miss what death actually is." Thomas leaned forward, his whole being focused on the being's presence. "What is it then? What happens when we die?" The being seemed to settle, becoming more solid, more present. Around them, the cemetery remained unnaturally still. No wind, no crickets, just that soft silver light and the presence of accumulated absence. All the lives that had ended here, all the love that had survived its objects. Death is not an ending, but neither is it the simple continuation your religions promise. It is transformation, metamorphosis. What you call the soul, the conscious awareness that feels like you, is real, but it is not separate from the universe. It is the universe experiencing itself through a particular lens, a particular configuration of matter and energy and time. When the body dies, that configuration dissolves. The lens breaks, but the light that passed through it does not disappear. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face. So Sarah still exists? Somewhere? The being's response carried weight, sorrow, infinite gentleness. Yes and no. The consciousness that was Sarah, her memories, her personality, her love for you, those patterns do not simply vanish. Energy cannot be destroyed, only transformed. But neither do they continue unchanged in some static paradise where she waits for you, frozen in the moment before death. She has returned to the source, the vast consciousness that underlies all existence. What some of your faiths call God, though that word carries so much baggage, it often obscures more than it reveals. So she's gone? Dissolved? Thomas's voice broke. This was somehow worse than simple extinction. The idea that Sarah existed but not as Sarah, that her essence had been absorbed into some cosmic whole where her individual self no longer mattered. The being emanated something that felt like a deep sigh, though no sound accompanied it. This is where human language fails, where your concepts of self and other, individual and collective, create false boundaries. Let me show you, not tell you, show you what death actually means. Before Thomas could respond, the world shifted. Not physically. He remained sitting on the bench, the cemetery still visible around him, but his awareness expanded beyond the confines of his skull, his skin, his sense of being a separate self contained in a particular body. He saw Sarah, not as a memory, not as a ghost, but as a pattern of consciousness that had existed briefly in physical form and now existed differently. She was woven into everything, into the atoms that had composed her body and were now dispersed across earth and air, into the thoughts of everyone who remembered her, into Thomas's own continued existence, shaping him in ways he couldn't fully recognize because he was standing too close to see the pattern. But more than that, he saw how her consciousness, the essential quality of Sarah-ness that had made her unique, had returned to a vast ocean of awareness, not lost in it, not erased, but the way a wave returns to the ocean, maintaining its pattern even as it merges back into the whole. She was individual and universal simultaneously, separate and unified, both and rather than either or. Thomas saw how inadequate his previous understanding had been. Heaven wasn't a place, it was a state of consciousness, union with the divine source that had always been there, that Sarah had always been part of even while alive, but that death allowed her to merge with more completely. She hadn't gone to heaven. She had become heaven, become part of the vast, loving awareness that held all things. And he saw something else, something that broke his heart even as it offered impossible comfort. Sarah was aware of him, not in the way a living person is aware, with focused attention and individual concern, but in the way the ocean is aware of every wave, every drop. She knew him because she was part of the knowing itself. When he thought of her, when he felt love for her, that love didn't vanish into void. It reached her because she was no longer separate from the fabric of existence that love moved through. The vision faded. Thomas found himself back in his ordinary consciousness, contained once again in the familiar boundaries of his body. But he was weeping openly now, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than grief. "She's not coming back," he said through tears. "Not as herself, not as the person I knew. No." The being's presence wrapped around Thomas's pain without trying to fix it or diminish it. Physical death is permanent. The Sarah you knew, the woman who made coffee in the morning and laughed at your jokes and held your hand, that particular expression of consciousness cannot be reconstructed. That was the heartbreak you needed to understand. The loss is real. The grief is appropriate. Love for a specific person in a specific form is one of the most beautiful and most painful aspects of physical existence. "Then what's the point?" Thomas asked bitterly. "If she's just scattered into the universe, absorbed into God or cosmic consciousness or whatever you want to call it, how is that different from her just being gone?" "Because she still loves you." The being moved even closer, and Thomas felt warmth that seemed to come from inside his own chest. Not Sarah's individual love, perhaps, but the love that Sarah has become part of, the love that is the universe's fundamental nature. You are still held by it, still connected to her through it, and one day, when your body dies, you will rejoin that ocean, and there will be recognition, not like two people meeting in a park, more like two drops of water finding each other in a stream and realizing they were always part of the same flow. Thomas sat in silence, processing. Around them, the cemetery began to stir back to life. A cricket ventured a tentative chirp. A breeze moved through the trees bordering the graveyard, the normal world reasserting itself around the impossible conversation. "What about Jesus?" Thomas asked finally. "What about the resurrection? My faith taught that the dead will rise, that we'll have new bodies, that it's not just dissolution into cosmic consciousness." The being's presence seemed to smile, though it had no face to smile with. "Your teacher understood, the one you call Jesus. He experienced death and returned to show you the truth, that consciousness survives, that love is eternal, that physical death is transformation rather than ending. But humans took his message and made it too literal, too small. He wasn't promising that your specific body would be reconstituted someday. He was showing you that the essence of who you are cannot be destroyed. That resurrection happens constantly, in every moment when consciousness emerges from matter, when love triumphs over fear, when individuals recognize their unity with the whole. So he was lying when he talked about eternal life? Not lying, simplifying, speaking in metaphors that humans of his time could understand. Eternal life is real, but it's not the endless continuation of your current form. It's the recognition that you were never truly separate from the eternal to begin with. Your consciousness arose from it. We'll return to it. In that sense, death is impossible. What you truly are cannot die because it was never merely the body, never merely the personality, never merely this brief configuration of atoms that calls itself Thomas Mercer. Thomas felt something shift in his chest. Not acceptance, exactly. More like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back too much pressure. The grief remained. The loss of Sarah in her specific form still hurt with an intensity that made breathing difficult. But alongside the pain, something else emerged. A sense that the universe was not indifferent. That consciousness was not a cosmic accident. That love, the love he felt for Sarah, the love she had embodied, was not just a chemical reaction or an evolutionary adaptation, but somehow fundamental to the structure of reality itself. Why are you telling me this? Thomas asked. Why now? Why me? Because you asked. Not with words, with your entire being. Every night you sit in that empty house, holding her ashes, asking questions you don't speak aloud. The universe hears. And sometimes, when the asking is sincere enough, when the pain has cracked you open enough, answers come. Not always in the form you expect, but they come. The being began to fade, becoming more translucent. The silver light dimmed gradually, returning the cemetery to ordinary darkness illuminated only by distant streetlights and the vast sweep of stars overhead. Wait, Thomas wanted to say. I have more questions. Tell me more. Tell me how to live with this. Tell me how to survive the loss when I know she's become something I can't touch or speak to or hold. But the being was already dissolving into light and shadow. Its final communication arrived not as words but as a feeling, a transmission of pure meaning that bypassed Thomas's conscious mind and settled directly into his heart. Live, love, remember, and know that every moment of genuine connection you create is eternal, not because it lasts forever in time, but because love exists outside time. When you loved Sarah, you were touching the divine, and that touch remains, woven into the fabric of what is, regardless of whether her body still breathes or your heart still beats. Then it was gone. Thomas sat alone on the bench, surrounded by headstones that marked the places where bodies had been laid to rest but where the people themselves had never truly been. The grief hadn't disappeared. If anything, it felt more acute now, more honest. Sarah was gone in every way that mattered to his daily life. He would never again hear her voice or feel her hand in his or see her smile across the breakfast table. But she wasn't annihilated, wasn't simply erased from existence. She had transformed into something he couldn't fully comprehend but could perhaps learn to sense. In the love he still felt for her, in the memories that surfaced unbidden, in the strange comfort of knowing that consciousness didn't end with death, even if it changed beyond recognition. Thomas stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting. He walked back through the cemetery, reading names he'd read 100 times before, but they felt different now. Not markers of endings, but markers of transformations, of souls returning to their source, of individuals rejoining the vast ocean of awareness that had always held them, even when they thought they were separate. The walk back to his shop felt longer than it should have, or maybe time had become elastic, the way it does in moments that change everything. The fluorescent lights inside looked harsh after the soft silver glow of the being's presence. The combine harvester waited with its seized engine, the same mechanical problem it had presented hours ago. But Thomas looked at it differently now. Metal and oil and combustion, matter arranged in configurations that accomplished specific tasks. And somewhere in that arrangement, in the complexity of systems working together, something almost like consciousness emerged. The engine wasn't alive, of course, but the principles that made it function were the same principles that made life possible. Energy transforming, patterns maintaining themselves, order arising from chaos and eventually returning to it. Everything was like that, Thomas realized. Everything was consciousness in various forms. Some configurations produced self-awareness, Humans, animals, perhaps other beings scattered across the universe that humans had never encountered. Other configurations produced simpler forms of organization. Plants, bacteria, the weather systems that moved across Montana skies. And at the foundation of it all, the basic substance of existence itself was aware in some fundamental way, the universe experiencing itself through infinite variations. Sarah had been one of those variations, unique, irreplaceable, and now she had returned to the source while somehow remaining individually significant, like a song that exists in its playing and then exists differently in memory, in the hearts of those who heard it, in the influence it has on future music. The song doesn't continue playing forever, but it was real, it mattered, and some essential quality of it persists. Thomas closed the shop without finishing the repair. He drove home through empty streets past darkened houses where people slept without knowing that a man had just learned the truth about death from a being that shouldn't exist. The house felt less empty when he entered. Or maybe he felt less empty. The distinction seemed less clear than it once had. He went to the bedroom and picked up the urn containing Sarah's ashes. The photograph beside it showed two young people who had no idea what the years would bring. Joy and loss. Love and death. Transformation. I understand now, Thomas whispered to the ashes that weren't really Sarah but were all he had left of her physical presence. You're not waiting for me somewhere. You've already moved on, become part of something bigger, but you're still here, somehow, in ways I can't quite grasp but can maybe learn to feel. He didn't expect an answer, didn't get one, at least not in words, but he felt something, a warmth, a presence. The same feeling he'd had sometimes when Sarah was alive and they'd sit together in comfortable silence, connected without needing to speak. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe it was his mind creating comfort from nothing. Or maybe the boundaries between real and imagined were less solid than he'd thought. Maybe consciousness really did persist. Maybe love really was eternal. Maybe Sarah really was still loving him, just not as Sarah anymore. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed watching the ceiling fan rotate slowly in the darkness, thinking about waves and oceans and consciousness that couldn't be destroyed. The encounter in the cemetery felt both absolutely real and completely impossible. In the harsh light of reason, he could construct explanations: grief hallucination, stress-induced psychosis, the desperate mind creating meaning from randomness because randomness was too painful to accept. But the mark on his left palm told a different story. He'd discovered it while washing his hands before bed, a symbol etched into his skin as if it had always been there, though he knew with absolute certainty it hadn't existed before tonight. The design was intricate, concentric circles intersecting with lines that suggested both mathematics and organic growth. It glowed faintly in darkness, pulsing with the same rhythm as his heartbeat. Or maybe his heartbeat was synchronizing with it. The distinction seemed meaningless. Thomas held his hand up toward the window, where starlight made the symbol more visible. The being had marked him, left evidence, or his subconscious had created a psychosomatic response so powerful it manifested physically. Either explanation required accepting something impossible. He thought about calling someone, his pastor maybe, or his brother in Billings. But what would he say? That he'd met an alien in the cemetery who'd explained the afterlife, that death wasn't ending or heaven but transformation into cosmic consciousness, that Sarah was simultaneously gone forever and eternally present? The words sounded insane even in his own mind. Dawn came slowly, painting the Montana sky in gradations of gray that eventually brightened to pale blue. Thomas rose from bed, exhausted but unable to rest, pulled on work clothes and drove to the shop through streets just beginning to wake. The town looked unchanged. Same grain elevator, same church, same houses where people were living ordinary lives, completely unaware that the universe had revealed itself to one of their neighbors. The shop smelled like it always did, oil and coffee, and the accumulated residue of decades of work. Thomas made a fresh pot, poured a cup he wouldn't drink, and stared at the combine harvester he hadn't finished repairing. The mechanical problem that had seemed important yesterday felt trivial now. Who cared whether an engine seized when consciousness itself was indestructible? Who cared about deadlines and schedules and the small concerns of daily life when death had been revealed as transformation rather than ending? But the work needed doing. The farmer whose combine sat in his shop depended on it for harvest. Bills needed paying. Life continued even when you'd learned truths that made ordinary life seem dreamlike and insubstantial. Thomas picked up his wrench and returned to the engine, letting the familiar motions anchor him. Remove the seized piston. Examine the scoring on the cylinder walls. Determine whether it needed a complete rebuild or just new rings. The work was meditative, requiring attention that left little room for existential questions about consciousness and death, and whether his dead wife still loved him from whatever non-place she'd become part of. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Other vehicles arrived for repair. A pickup with transmission problems. A sedan making concerning noises from the front end. Thomas worked methodically, his hands remembering skills they'd performed thousands of times while his mind circled endlessly around the previous night's encounter. Around noon, Pastor Mitchell stopped by. A good man, sincere in his faith, with gray hair and kind eyes and the gentle certainty of someone who'd never seriously questioned the foundations of his belief. He'd been checking on Thomas regularly since Sarah's death, offering comfort and prayer and invitations to church functions that Thomas attended out of habit rather than conviction. "Thomas," the pastor said, standing in the bay door with sunlight behind him, "thought I'd see how you're doing. You weren't at service on Sunday." Thomas wiped grease from his hands, considering how to respond. "Been busy. This combine needs to get back to the Johnsons before their wheat starts rotting in the field." Pastor Mitchell nodded, but his eyes held concern. "It's okay to not be okay, you know. Sarah's death it's a wound that takes time to heal." "Does it heal?" Thomas heard himself ask. "Or do we just get used to carrying it?" The pastor moved closer, his expression shifting into counseling mode. "Both, I think. The pain becomes less sharp, and we find comfort in knowing Sarah is with the Lord now, in paradise, waiting for the day when we'll be reunited." Thomas looked down at his palm, at the symbol still faintly visible in the daylight. What if that's not how it works? What if death is something else entirely? "What do you mean?" Thomas almost told him. Almost described the being in the cemetery, the visions of Sarah dissolved into cosmic consciousness, the revelation that heaven wasn't a place but a state of merger with the divine source. But he stopped himself. Pastor Mitchell's faith was beautiful in its simplicity. Who was Thomas to complicate it with impossible truths that might not even be true? "Nothing," Thomas said. "Just grief makes you question everything, I guess." The pastor placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Doubt is natural, but don't let it shake your foundation. God's plan is beyond our understanding, but his love is constant. Sarah is safe with him. That's the promise we hold on to." After the pastor left, Thomas stood alone in the shop, feeling the weight of secrets he couldn't share. The symbol on his palm pulsed gently, a reminder that something had happened, something real, even if he couldn't prove it, even if speaking about it would make people question his sanity. He returned to work, but concentration proved difficult. His hands moved through familiar motions while his mind kept replaying the being's words. "She has returned to the source, the vast consciousness that underlies all existence." It sounded beautiful in the abstract, but in practical terms it meant Sarah was gone, not waiting for him, not watching over him, dissolved into something so vast that her individuality no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Was that supposed to be comforting? The afternoon wore on. Thomas finished the combine repair, tested the engine, and was satisfied with the results. He called the Johnsons to let them know it was ready for pickup. Normal tasks, normal day. As if his entire understanding of existence hadn't been shattered 12 hours earlier. Around 4 o'clock, a battered pickup pulled into the shop. Thomas didn't recognize the vehicle or the young woman who climbed out. She looked to be in her mid-20s with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and a heaviness in her movements that Thomas recognized, the weight of fresh grief. "Are you Thomas Mercer?" she asked, her voice thin and uncertain. "I am. What can I help you with?" She glanced back at the pickup, then met his eyes. "My truck's been making a noise, but honestly, that's not why I'm here. This is going to sound crazy, but I had a dream last night. A voice told me to come to this shop, told me to find Thomas Mercer, said you would understand." Thomas felt his heartbeat accelerate. The symbol on his palm grew warmer. "Understand what?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My husband died 3 weeks ago. Construction accident. And I don't know how to keep living. Don't know if I want to. But the dream was so vivid, so real, and it said you could help, that you'd been shown something." Thomas stared at her, understanding flooding through him. This was why. This was the reason the being had appeared to him, not just for his own healing, but so he could offer something to others drowning in the same questions that had been suffocating him. "Come inside," Thomas said gently. Let's talk." They sat in the shop's small office, surrounded by filing cabinets and outdated calendars, and the mundane detritus of a small business. The woman's name was Rebecca. Her husband had been 28. They'd been married for 3 years. He'd fallen from scaffolding on a job site in Missoula, died instantly, left her alone with grief so overwhelming she'd been planning her own death when the dream came. Thomas listened as she spoke, hearing his own anguish reflected in her words. The impossibility of continuing when the person who made life meaningful was gone. The hollow comfort of religious platitudes about heaven. The desperate hope that death wasn't truly final, warring with the evidence of absolute absence. When she finished, Thomas looked down at his palm. The symbol was glowing now, clearly visible even in the office's fluorescent lighting. Rebecca's eyes widened when she saw it. "What is that?" she whispered. "Proof," Thomas said, "that something impossible is also real." He told her everything. The cemetery, the being, the visions of Sarah transformed into something both gone and eternal. The revelation that consciousness survived death, but not in the literal, simple way their faith had taught. The heartbreaking truth that the people they loved weren't waiting for them, but had become part of something vast and incomprehensible, yet somehow still connected through the love that persisted. Rebecca listened with an intensity that reminded Thomas of himself the previous night. Someone desperate for meaning, willing to accept anything that made the unbearable slightly more bearable. "So they're not in heaven?" she asked when he finished. "Not watching over us?" "They're in something like heaven," Thomas said slowly, working through his own understanding as he spoke. "But it's not a place. It's a state of consciousness. Unity with everything. Your husband hasn't disappeared, he's been transformed, absorbed back into the source. But the love you shared, that's eternal. That persists. Not because he's a ghost watching you, but because love itself is fundamental to existence." "How is that different from him just being gone?" Rebecca's voice broke on the last word. Thomas reached across the desk and took her hand. The moment their skin touched, something extraordinary happened. The symbol on his palm flared brightly, and suddenly Thomas could see what Rebecca couldn't. Her husband. Not as a ghost or an apparition, but as a pattern of consciousness still woven into the fabric of reality. He was there, present in Rebecca's continued existence, in her memories, in the love she still carried, in the way his life had shaped hers, and would continue shaping it even though his body no longer breathed. But more than that, Thomas saw how her husband existed in the vast ocean of consciousness the being had shown him, individual enough to be recognizable, universal enough to be everywhere at once. He was the peace Rebecca felt in unexpected moments, the unexpected strength she discovered when she thought she had none left, the voice in her dream that had sent her here, to this shop, to find someone who could explain what couldn't be explained but could perhaps be felt. Thomas didn't try to describe what he was seeing. Instead, he held Rebecca's hand and let the vision flow through their connection. Let her feel what he felt. Let her sense what he sensed. The symbol on his palm acted like a bridge, allowing her consciousness to expand beyond its normal boundaries and touch the truth that existed beyond words. Rebecca gasped. Tears streamed down her face. Her eyes went wide with wonder and recognition and grief that somehow coexisted with peace. She was feeling her husband, not seeing him or hearing him, but sensing his presence in the only way presence could persist after physical death, as love itself, as the underlying awareness that held all things. When the vision faded and Thomas released her hand, they sat in silence. Rebecca's tears continued, but the quality had changed. Not the desperate tears of someone lost in darkness, but something more complex. Grief that acknowledged loss while also recognizing that loss wasn't the entire truth. "He's not coming back," Rebecca said finally. "But he's not gone either." "No," Thomas agreed. "He's not gone. Just transformed into something we weren't designed to fully comprehend while we're still in these bodies." Rebecca wiped her eyes, a small smile flickering across her face. That should be cold comfort. Should feel like losing him twice. But somehow, it doesn't. Somehow it feels like he just stepped into the next room, and I can't follow yet, but I can sense he's there. "That's as good a metaphor as any," Thomas said. Rebecca stood to leave, moving with more energy than when she'd arrived. At the door, she turned back. "Thank you. I don't know how you know this. Don't know if it's real or if I just needed to believe something and my brain cooperated, but it saved my life. Literally saved it. I was planning to end things tonight. Now I think I can keep going." After she left, Thomas sat alone in the office, staring at his palm. The symbol had dimmed again, becoming subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice it, but it was there, real, evidence of an impossible encounter that had somehow given him the ability to offer comfort he couldn't have provided otherwise. This was the miracle, not the being itself or the visions or even the mark on his palm. The miracle was connection restored, pain transformed into purpose, grief that became the foundation for helping others navigate their own grief. Over the following days, more people came. Thomas didn't advertise, didn't tell anyone beyond Rebecca about what he'd experienced. But somehow word spread in the way things spread in small towns. Whispered conversations, dreams that felt like messages, the mysterious sense that certain people needed to find certain other people at certain times. A farmer whose daughter had died in a car accident. A widow who'd lost her husband to Alzheimer's and wondered if the man she'd loved had even existed anymore by the end. A teenager whose best friend had committed suicide, leaving behind questions that would never be answered in ordinary terms. They came to the shop ostensibly for repairs, but really for the comfort Thomas found himself able to offer. When he held their hands, when the symbol on his palm connected with their grief, they experienced what he had experienced. A glimpse of the truth that consciousness survived death, transformed but not erased. That love persisted, that the universe was aware and compassionate in ways that transcended human understanding of awareness and compassion. Thomas didn't always succeed in comforting them. Some people couldn't accept what they experienced. Some clung to simpler narratives. Literal heaven, guardian angels, the promise of unchanged reunion. And that was okay. Thomas wasn't trying to convert anyone or challenge their faith. He was simply offering what he'd been given, a different way of understanding death that made it slightly less terrifying without denying its genuine tragedy. Church became complicated. Pastor Mitchell noticed the change in Thomas, the new peace he carried, the way he listened to sermons with a slight smile that suggested he was hearing additional layers of meaning beneath the words. The pastor invited Thomas to lunch, gently probing about what had shifted. "You seem different," Pastor Mitchell said over sandwiches at the town's only diner. "More at peace. Has your grief lessened?" Thomas considered how to answer honestly. "The grief hasn't lessened, but my understanding has expanded. I realized that death and resurrection aren't future events we wait for. They're happening constantly. Every moment consciousness is dying and being reborn. Physical death is just the most dramatic version of something that's always occurring." The pastor frowned. "That sounds almost Buddhist, or New Age. Are you saying you don't believe in the Christian promise of eternal life?" "I believe in it more than ever," Thomas said carefully. "I just think eternal life might not look the way we've been taught. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is within us, is among us, is here now. What if he meant that literally? What if heaven isn't a place we go after we die, but a state of consciousness we can touch even while alive, and death is just full immersion in that state?" Pastor Mitchell set down his sandwich, his expression troubled. "Thomas, I'm concerned. Grief can make us vulnerable to false teachings, to ideas that sound comforting but lead us away from biblical truth. What if biblical truth is bigger than we've imagined?" Thomas asked. "What if God is so vast, so beyond our categories, that our attempts to define him actually limit him?" They talked for another hour, eventually reaching an impasse. The pastor held to traditional interpretations. Thomas couldn't unsee what he'd been shown. They parted amicably, but Thomas knew something had shifted in their relationship. He no longer fit comfortably in the church he'd attended for decades. Not because the church was wrong, but because his understanding had expanded beyond its boundaries. That Sunday, Thomas went to church one last time. He sat in his usual pew beside the empty space where Sarah used to sit, and listened to a sermon about the resurrection of the dead. The pastor spoke with conviction about bodies rising from graves, about the trumpet call that would summon believers to paradise, about the new heaven and new earth where death would be no more. Thomas listened with compassion. The pastor wasn't lying. He was describing one valid interpretation of mystery that exceeded human language. But Thomas now knew there were other interpretations, other ways of understanding resurrection that were equally true. The body Sarah had inhabited wouldn't rise from anything. It had been cremated, transformed into ash and smoke and elements that would cycle back into earth and air. But consciousness itself was being resurrected constantly. Every moment, someone felt love. Every moment, awareness emerged from matter. Every moment, the eternal expressed itself through temporary forms. After the service, Thomas walked to the cemetery alone. The gates stood open as they always did during daylight hours. He made his way to the spot where he'd encountered the being, finding it ordinary now. Just grass and headstones and the accumulated memory of a small town's dead. But when Thomas placed his palm against the earth, the symbol glowing faintly, he felt something. Presence. Not Sarah specifically, but the vast consciousness she'd become part of. The ocean of awareness that held all things. It didn't speak to him, didn't offer new revelations or comfort. It simply existed, patient and infinite, waiting for the moment when Thomas's own body would fail and his consciousness would return to its source. He wasn't afraid anymore. Death had lost its terror. Not because he'd be reunited with Sarah in some literal heaven, where they'd hold hands and walk on streets of gold, but because he'd been shown that consciousness was the fundamental substance of existence. That what he truly was couldn't die because it had never truly been separate from the eternal to begin with. His body would fail eventually. The configuration of cells and organs and electrical impulses that generated the sense of being Thomas Mercer would dissolve. But the awareness that had looked out through Thomas's eyes, that had loved Sarah, that was even now trying to comprehend these impossible truths, that would persist, transform, merge back into the source while somehow maintaining the pattern that made it unique. It wasn't the comfort he'd wanted. He wanted Sarah back, wanted her laugh and her touch and her presence beside him at breakfast. But desires didn't change reality, and reality, he now understood, was both more tragic and more beautiful than simple narratives could capture. Thomas stood and walked back through the cemetery, reading names carved in stone. All these people who'd thought they were separate individuals, living isolated lives, dying lonely deaths. But they'd never been separate, never been isolated. They were waves in an ocean that didn't care about the distinction between wave and water. They were thoughts in a mind that encompassed everything. They were love experiencing itself through countless temporary forms, each one precious, each one eternal in its own way. The next morning, Thomas opened his shop as usual. A repair job waited. Someone's carburetor needed rebuilding. Simple work, mechanical work, the kind of task that didn't require contemplating the nature of consciousness or the persistence of love beyond death. He was grateful for it. But as he worked, he found himself thinking about Sarah differently, not with the desperate grief of the early months or even the aching loss of recent weeks. Instead, he thought of her with something approaching peace. She was gone. She would always be gone in the way that mattered to his daily life, but she existed in him, in his memories, in the way she'd shaped him, in the love he still carried, and beyond that, in ways he couldn't fully grasp, she existed in the universe itself, woven into the fabric of what is. That evening, Thomas scattered her ashes, not in a meaningful place or according to any particular ritual. He simply drove out to the land where they'd talked about maybe building a house someday, back when the future seemed vast and full of possibility. He opened the urn and let the wind take what remained of Sarah's body, carrying it across Montana fields where it would settle and merge with soil, and eventually become part of plants and animals, and the cycling elements that composed all physical things. "Goodbye," Thomas said to the wind. "Thank you. I love you. I always will." The ashes scattered and disappeared. Thomas stood alone on empty land under a sky beginning to fill with stars. He felt the symbol on his palm pulse once, warmly, like an acknowledgement. Then it faded completely, becoming invisible even when he looked directly at it. The mark remained, but only he could see it now. Only he knew it was there. The gift had been given. The message delivered. Thomas had been changed from someone who grieved without hope to someone who grieved with understanding. The loss remained real. The pain remained sharp. But beneath both loss and pain lay a foundation of knowing that consciousness was eternal, that love persisted, that death was transformation rather than ending. He would carry that knowing for the rest of his life, would offer it to others when they found their way to his shop, guided by dreams or intuition, or the mysterious ways grief connected people who needed each other, would live differently, not better or worse, but with more presence, more awareness, more willingness to touch the eternal that existed within every temporary moment. The being had said death was humanity's greatest teacher. Thomas understood now. Death taught that nothing physical lasted, that bodies failed and relationships ended and everything built would eventually crumble. But in teaching that truth, death also revealed its opposite, that something endured, not despite change but through it, consciousness transforming across forms, love persisting across separations, the eternal expressing itself through the temporary in an endless dance of birth and death and rebirth. Thomas drove home through darkness, watching stars emerge as daylight faded. Somewhere up there, beyond the atmosphere, beyond the solar system, beyond the galaxy itself, the being existed, or beings like it, watching humanity struggle with questions they were still learning to ask. Questions about consciousness and death and whether love was merely chemistry or something more fundamental. The being had given him answers, but Thomas realized the answers weren't the point. The point was living with the questions. Living fully despite knowing death waited. Creating meaning even though nothing physical endured. Loving completely while accepting that loss was inevitable. That was the heartbreak. That was the secret. Death didn't diminish life. It intensified it. Made every moment precious because moments ended. Made love profound because love persisted despite endings, woven into the structure of existence itself. Thomas Mercer was 56 years old. Statistically, he had maybe 20 years left. Maybe 30 if he was lucky. His body would age, his mind would slow. Eventually, the configuration that generated his consciousness would fail, and he would die. And then he would understand completely. Would merge with the ocean Sarah had already joined. Would recognize himself in everything because everything was consciousness wearing different masks. Would love and be loved not as Thomas Mercer, but as the awareness that had always existed beneath that temporary name. For now, though, he was still here, still in this body. Still living this life, still missing Sarah in ways that would never fully heal. And that was okay. That was beautiful. That was the entire point of being human. To love so completely that loss became unbearable. Because loss proved the love had been real. Thomas parked in his driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the house that had once held Sarah's presence and now held only memory. Then he went inside, made dinner, watched television, did the ordinary things that comprised a life. But nothing was ordinary anymore. Everything was sacred. Every breath, every thought, every moment of awareness that proved consciousness existed and persisted and couldn't be destroyed by the simple death of a body. The being had broken his heart by showing him Sarah wasn't waiting for him, but it had also healed his heart by showing him Sarah wasn't truly gone. Both truths coexisted. Both were real. And learning to hold both simultaneously, the loss and the persistence, the grief and the peace, the ending and the continuation, was perhaps the most human thing anyone could do. Perhaps death isn't the opposite of life. Perhaps it's the ultimate teacher of what life actually means. Perhaps the ones we lose don't leave us. They become us, woven into our thoughts and choices and the love we carry forward into a world that needs love more than it needs certainty. Perhaps heaven isn't above. Perhaps it's everywhere, just beyond the thin membrane of consciousness that makes us feel separate from everything else. Perhaps aliens aren't strangers from distant worlds. Perhaps they're messengers from the space between things, the gap between life and death where truth lives too large for human words. Perhaps Jesus understood this. Perhaps all the great teachers understood that we are not separate from God but expressions of God. That death is not punishment but transformation. That resurrection happens every moment we choose love over fear. Perhaps the afterlife secret that breaks your heart is the one that also heals it. They're gone. They're here. Both statements are true. The loss is real and the love is eternal. The separation hurts and the connection persists. Perhaps the hardest wisdom is learning that life requires us to hold contradictions, to grieve while trusting, to miss people while knowing they're woven into everything, to die while remaining eternal. Perhaps that's why we're given these brief lives, not to pass some test, not to earn rewards, but to learn what it means to love something temporary with all the intensity of something eternal. Perhaps Thomas Mercer learned this in a cemetery in Montana, or perhaps his grief created a beautiful story his heart needed to survive. Perhaps it doesn't matter which is true.